guys, welcome back to Unit 3, Outcome 2, Key Knowledge 9, and this one is on awards and agreements. Okay, so here is our study design, and here we can see the penultimate key knowledge dot point, awards and agreements as methods of determining wages and conditions of work. All right, so what is this all about? Awards and agreements probably doesn't mean too much to you at this stage. Now, look, the reality is when an employer employs people, there's a few different ways in which they can determine how they're going to pay their employees. Now, we're going to look at the main two, awards and agreements. So it's not just about pay, it's also the working conditions, and you'll kind of see that in action in a minute. So how do we set up the employment contracts for our employees? Okay, so two main ways to do this in Australia. One is awards, one is agreements. And any of you that have a job right now, like a part-time job, a holiday job, you will be being paid to one of these two, okay? On a very simplistic level, what this basically means is that the business can choose to pay the minimum wages and conditions for their employees for their industry. That's an award. Or they can choose to go above those minimum standards and put in place an agreement. Okay, that's kind of where we're going with this. So first off, let's look at awards. Okay, now awards often referred to, or can be alternatively referred to, as an industry award or sometimes a modern award. So if you see those two expressions in the media, then it means the same thing. So award, industry award, modern award. Basically, an award is a legal document outlining the minimum wages and conditions for work across an entire industry. Okay, so that's the key for this one. An award applies to everybody working in a certain industry. So a business that chooses to use this method to set the pay and conditions in their workplace, what they're doing basically is providing the national minimum standards that they're legally allowed to within that industry. Okay, I just said that before. So these minimum standards are set and they're reviewed each year by the Fair Work Commission. So they create and maintain these awards, and there's over 100 of them. As of 2022, there was 122 of them. It kind of changes year to year. They might add in a couple, take a couple away. Some might be merged even, but roughly 120, 130 is where we're at right now as of 2023 anyway. And what they basically do is act as a safety net for employees within that industry, because employees cannot legally provide any less in terms of pay conditions than what that award states. And then they are enforced by the Fair Work Ombudsman. Now, there used to be one government body, Fair Work Australia, which kind of did both, but they've kind of separated these two in recent years. So we've got the Fair Work Commission that sets and reviews them. And then if there's any dramas with them, then it goes to the Fair Work Ombudsman. So both obviously federal government departments, but just be aware of kind of who does what in the process. So look, if you went into the Fair Work Commission website, just Google Fair Work Commission, go into the first hit you see, all the agreements and awards are there, and you can see all the details of all of them. So for example, if you weren't sure that with your employer you were being paid fairly, or if you didn't have the right, you weren't being given the right conditions, then you could go into the website pretty easily and have a look at what you're supposed to be getting for all intents and purposes. So you just click on, and this is just a list. If you start clicking through the different awards, you can see there: Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement Award, Aged Care Award, Air Pilots Award. You can see what I mean, Aircraft Cabin Crew Award. Obviously this is in alphabetical order, and you can keep clicking through and click on the one that applies to you, and you can check it out and see if you're getting the right pay and conditions basically. So you can see one there, the Fast Food Industry Awards 2020. Okay, so if you clicked onto that one, because this is one which I think might apply to some of you if you're working at Macca's or KFC or Hungry Jack's or whatever, this is the one that may well apply to you. So you can go in there and you can start scrolling through, and you can see there's a huge amount of information here. The request for flexible working arrangements, a huge amount of stuff. This is a legal document. It covers every single aspect of the pay and conditions in that industry. You see some stuff there: casual employees, hours of work. This is interesting to maybe breaks. Okay, so if you're not sure that you're getting enough breaks with your employer, it gives you a table there and it tells you, for how long you're working, how many breaks you're supposed to get, for example. And then rates of pay. So here's some rates of pay that are the minimums that must be set, and you can even see there for different ages as well. So if you're 16, you can see what's that, 50% of the minimum wage for an adult for that particular industry, and so on and so forth. So you could go in and check out your own industry if you have a job and just make sure that everything is all above board. And let me tell you, it isn't always, even for big companies. Some big companies are not meeting some of these, and I've seen that many times over the years. So it's worth having a look at. If you have a job, go into the relevant award and see what the score is. Okay, just out of interest here, you don't need to know this, but just out of interest, you can see there's a ranking of OECD countries by national minimum wage. This is 2-year-old information, but still the numbers would be different now, but the rankings would be pretty much the same, I would imagine. You can see that Australia sits second in the world in terms of the minimum wage. It's one of the reasons that, there's not a lot of manufacturing done in Australia these days. A lot of stuff is offshored because basically it's so expensive to operate businesses in Australia. Second highest on the planet to Luxembourg. And these figures are in US dollars. But, just interesting to point out that in terms of our workforce, Australia legally kind of protects our workers more than most countries. Now, businesses use awards to set the wages and conditions. That also must uphold something called the National Employment Standards, the NES. Now, there's 11 of them, and again, they're set by the Fair Work Commission, and they cover these 11 minimum standards. And again, you would just click through the website to look in more detail at these. So there's 11 of them, like I said. Until a year ago, until 2022, there was 10, and they actually included the third one that you see on the screen there, offers and requests to convert from casual to permanent employment. That was one that was added in, and I'll look at that one in a little bit more detail in a minute. So there was a reason that was added in. But yeah, so now we have these 11. So maximum weekly hours, request for flexible working arrangements, so on and so forth. You don't need to know these, but it's good to just have an understanding. You certainly need to know that these exist and kind of what they're there for, but you don't need to know the details of individual ones. But I will look at a couple of individual ones just to kind of give you an idea of what they're there and what they're there for. So one of them was maximum weekly hours. Okay, so the national employee standards say that an employer must not request or require an employee to work more than the following hours of work in a week unless the additional hours are reasonable. Now, for a full-time employee, 38 hours. So in Australia, a full-time working week is 38 hours. Or the employee's ordinary hours of work in a week. So if you usually work less than 38, then that number would apply. Now, I'll just point out, I've just highlighted there in purple, unless the additional hours are reasonable. That's a thing with the NES. The standards, the language they often use kind of is a little bit vague, and I guess it kind of almost allows a bit of a cop-out for the employer, unless, what's reasonable. You'd have to argue that point, I guess, in court if you wanted to take it there. And there is a lot of that kind of language in these things. Another one was flexible working arrangements. I think that was the second one on the list. So employees, other than a casual employee, so if you're a permanent employee, if you've worked for the same employer for at least a year, they can request flexible working arrangements and there's a bunch of different requirements that you have to meet. There's a few more as well, but just to kind of give you a bit of an idea, basically it's mainly around people with caring responsibilities, small kids, other types of caring responsibilities, that sort of stuff. Okay. And again, I point out the language used, can request flexible working arrangements. It doesn't say you're entitled to, it says can request. But having said that, if you dig through the website a little deeper, it actually gives you the bases on which an employee can kind of turn your request down, and it's pretty tight. So as long as your request is reasonable, and then the business kind of has to give you what you're asking for to a point. And all this is about the government trying to promote flexibility in the workplace to allow people with caring responsibilities to meet both their work requirements and also the requirements of those responsibilities they have outside of work. So that's kind of what's behind all of this. Now, this one I did say I was going to come back to, the offers and requests to convert from casual to permanent employment. And I guess the reason I wanted to point this one out, because again, this might impact some of you in your jobs now. And the reason this one was put into place in 2022 was to basically protect the rights a bit more of casual employees. As you may well be aware, casual employees don't have anything like the level of rights that permanent employees do. And I think the case was that a lot of businesses were keeping people on as casuals for many, many years because it meant that they didn't have to provide them with as many benefits, sick pay, holiday pay, that sort of thing. So it's kind of a bit of a cop-out for businesses. So to protect the rights of casual employees, now legally, once you've been there for a year, and again, there are some caveats around this, which you can kind of dig into the website. But basically, most casual employees, once you've been working for the employer on a casual basis for a year, then you should be given the offer to convert to permanent. Now, if you're a casual part-time, then you would convert to permanent part-time. And like I say, certain eligibility requirements, and you can dig those through. One thing where this might not apply to some of you, small business employers are not required to offer this conversion. And again, if you dig into the website, it will qualify what they mean by a small business employer. So it wouldn't necessarily apply to all of you, but may well apply to some of you. So if you are fed up with being a casual, you've been there for more than a year, you're not getting enough shifts, or it's all a bit sporadic, as long as they're a fair size business, and again, you could go into the website to check, then you have the right to request being taken on as a permanent employee. Okay, so the critical point with these awards. No employer in Australia is allowed to offer wages and conditions to their employees that are below A, the award set for that industry, so those 120 plus that we looked at before, or those 11 things set out in the National Employment Standards. So no one can receive pay and conditions less than these awards. Okay. Now, moving on to agreements. Okay. So the second way in which you may currently be being paid. So an agreement, and again, there's different terminology that is used to refer to these: an enterprise agreement, an enterprise bargaining agreement, or even a collective agreement. So there's a whole bunch of different ways in which these are referred to. So we'll just refer to them as agreements. That's how referred to in the study design. So again, it's a legal document, a contract, just like the award. But instead of outlining the wages and conditions of employment for an entire industry, it outlines the wages and conditions for employment at a particular business or a group of businesses, whichever business or group of businesses that this agreement applies to. Okay, so we're kind of narrowing down here. So rather than going with just those awards that we looked at, business has the option of taking this route. Okay, and when we look at the advantages and disadvantages of each of these avenues the business can take, the reasons that the business might choose to do this as opposed to go via the award route kind of become a bit more obvious. The process of actually establishing the agreement is called the collective bargaining or the enterprise bargaining process. And this is where the employers and the employees, although it's not usually the employees themselves, it's usually the union reps. We looked at unions in the previous Key Knowledge dot point. We looked at participants in the workplace. So they do this collectively on behalf of the employees in a particular business or group of businesses. They negotiate the wages and conditions and ultimately end up at some kind of an agreement that both the employer and the employees are happy with. So the process is the negotiations go on in the background. Then once an agreement is made, that agreement then goes off to the Fair Work Commission and they ratify it. And once they ratify and approve it, it then gets put in place. Okay, so the agreement is made usually between the unions and the employers. Fair Work Commission put their eyes over it just to make sure it ticks all the legal boxes it needs to. Then Fair Work Commission approve it. And once Fair Work Commission approve it, it then is put in place. Now, for the agreement to be approved, it must exceed the wages and conditions set out in the relevant industry award. Okay, that's absolutely key to know. Okay, so any agreement must exceed the award that would otherwise be in place. Unlike awards, which leave the decision on wages and conditions basically to the government, the Fair Work Commission, what it means if you're going to use an agreement is that businesses can actually have a say in coming up with the wages and conditions that suit both the employer and the employees. Okay, the employer might decide that the award, for whatever reason, and again, in the advantages and disadvantages, that will come a bit more clear. But it gives the employer a bit more flexibility over what they're doing within their business. Rather than just going with the government, this is what you're going to do, it allows you to kind of come up with something that is beneficial perhaps for your business. Now, for agreement to be approved, so that little process we talked about before, so for the Fair Work Commission to actually approve the agreement, it must provide better wages and conditions in the relevant award, like I just said, and it must meet all of those NES, the 11 standards as well. And it must also be mutually agreed to by the employers and the employees. Okay, so that was that first stage. It has to be agreed. It's not going to go to the Fair Work Commission for approval until it's been agreed between the employees and the employers. And that can be quite a process. And it's then documented in writing, and that's a document that then goes to the Fair Work Commission for approval. Now, once the agreement has been made, it applies for the time stated in the agreement, and that's usually 4 years. It's quite unusual for it to not be 4 years, but usually it's a 4-year process. And then what happens in the third year of that agreement, that's when the process of negotiation for that next 4-year period starts. So in an ideal world, what would happen in that third year, the next agreement is made, and by the time the 4-year agreement has expired, you're ready to put in place the next one. Sometimes that doesn't happen. It can roll over if there's a lot of negotiation, it's going back and forth. It can roll over into the next one, but then once it's ultimately agreed, any pay is kind of back paid to any employees that it applies to. Now, once an agreement has been established at a workplace, the relevant award will no longer apply. So an agreement always trumps an award. So if there's award in place, if there's an agreement in place, the award then is not valid in that particular workplace anymore. Now, looking at advantages and disadvantages of each, and again, this will make some of this stuff a bit more clear, particularly as to why you might go one option as opposed to the other. So first off, looking at awards, the positives, the pros, the advantages. Look, there's complete transparency and equality for employees right across an entire industry. So if you're working in the fast food industry, and there's people in other businesses working in the fast food industry, we have equality across businesses. Now, I guess that depends on your political kind of standpoint, if you think that is a positive or not. But generally speaking, you could count that as a positive, that it kind of puts some equality across an industry. Second one, it saves time because the awards are already set. You don't have to go through this whole agreement process, which I kind of touched on before, can be a bit of a lengthy process going back and forth. And in the final outcome, when we look at dispute resolution, we'll look at how that might play out. It can be really, really time consuming. So if you're just going to put in place the award, it's all there. You just put it in place. It's done and dusted. You don't have to go through all of this work. And also cost saving. It's cost effective because of the time saved from the previous point. But also, of course, because an agreement is likely to lead to wages and conditions that are going to be more expensive for the business because you have to offer more than what the relevant award would be offering. So you're usually coming out at the end, paying your people a higher pay rate and perhaps giving them better conditions than if you'd have just gone with the award. And obviously there's a cost to the business for doing that. Now, looking at the negatives of the awards, might lead to lower employee satisfaction because they might be aware that they're only receiving the minimum wages and conditions applicable for their industry. And again, they might have a friend or someone that they know that works in another very similar business down the road who is on an agreement, and they might be getting a much better pay rate than, for doing the exact same job. Okay, so employee satisfaction might be an issue if you are sticking to the award. But mainly I would say, look, it means the business has no control over the wages and conditions being applied in their business. So is lack of control a good thing? I guess as a business owner, as a business manager, you want to have as much control over your business operation as possible. And effectively, if you're using an award, what you're doing is handing control over a fairly substantial part of your operation to the government. Okay. And that final point I've got there, you can't use wages and conditions as an attraction and retention tool. So in other words, if you're just going with the award, or more, if you wanted to put in place an agreement, you could actually go, look, we're going to pay more to our employees as a means of attracting the best employees in the industry, and then also retain them, keep them as well. Now, if you're going to go with the award, you can't do that because you're paying the lowest pay you possibly can in the industry. So you're not going to attract the best employees because they know they could probably go somewhere else, which has an agreement in place, and earn more for basically doing the same job. Now, agreements, the positives here, much more control for the business. Okay. Wages and conditions. Wages is a pretty hefty part of the cost of a business. So at least you have some control over this aspect of running a business. Like I just said before, you can use the agreement as an attraction and retention tool by offering better paying conditions than your competitors, perhaps. Now, this sounds a bit repetitive maybe, but if you think about it, these two are kind of opposite. So the positives of one become the negatives of the other. So that's kind of why this is looking the way it does. From the employee's perspective, the wages and conditions they're going to get are going to be higher than if they were paid to the award, and therefore motivation might increase in the business if you have an agreement in place, because people know they're being paid more than what legally the business has to pay. So that can act as a motivator. The negatives, we now have inequality amongst employees across an industry. And again, depending on your political standing, you could view that as a negative potentially. More time consuming and more expensive for the business. Again, we're just flipping things around here because now you have to go through this enterprise bargaining process every 4 years, which, like I said, can be a very, very lengthy process. And that process in itself, that bargaining process, can actually lead to a lot of tension between employees and employers. Tension between the bosses and the workers is never a good thing. And in a worst case scenario, that can actually lead to industrial action being taken. And we look at industrial action in the next key knowledge dot point when we look at dispute resolution. Okay, so look, that is it for that key knowledge dot point. Fairly simple, I think. Look, this is one which used to be a lot more complex in the previous study design, but a lot of students, and to be fair, teachers were kind of struggling with some of the concepts. They've kind of pared it right back. So hopefully that made some sense to you. We'll talk about it a bit more in class, but that's it for that one. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers for now.